The opening of A Plague Tale Requiem is one of the most serene and joyful experiences I've had playing a game in a long time. With the worst behind them, Hugo and Amicia have settled down, and you're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop and everything to go to hell. But let me tell you, the shoe doesn't just drop, it plummets head first into the horrors of the plague. I haven't seen this kind of contrast in a mood since the farmhouse scene in The Last of Us Part 2. That brings us nicely along to Amicia and how Ellie greatly influenced the character in the sequel. If there were a game I'd recommend to someone who wanted to play another game like The Last of Us, A Plague Tale Innocence would have been the #1 answer. It takes the basic story of The Last of Us and gives it a unique setting and twist that makes it an easy recommendation. That's not to say that those two games are equals. It's like The Batman is a great Batman movie, but it's not The Dark Knight. Those similarities that Innocence and The Last of Us Part 1 shared are also shared by Requiem and Part 2. Not so much in the plot this time, as while The Last of Us was content to leave behind the zombies and tell a human story, Requiem plunges back into the plague. Where these two games align is in their main characters. Part 2 Ellie and Amicia are almost indistinguishable at times. They're suicidally driven towards a single goal at any cost to themselves. But while Ellie seeks to destroy, Amicia tries to save. Both games entirely rely on you sympathizing enough with the protagonist to excuse their barbarity. While The Last of Us shows how easy it is to hate, Requiem asks us to love. Your opinion on the actions of Amicia depends on how much you liked her and Hugo in the last game. I liked those two characters and found them to be some of the best written characters in the last 5 years, so I found their actions justifiable. However, the developers don't seem to want you to grapple with the idea of whether what they're doing is right, because everyone who isn't one of the main characters is portrayed as an irredeemable monster. The antagonists of both Plague Tale games have been so despicable that you, the player, feel no remorse for them as their bodies are swarmed and become nests for the rats to burrow in. Wouldn't it be more effective if we had to struggle with the choice to kill? But instead, the developers don't want you to feel any remorse. It's a huge missed opportunity. Moving on to the narrative, Innocence told an incredibly personal story about two orphans on the run that started to get a little out of hand by the end, with what seemed like magic. I wasn't a fan of this, as it felt too much like a fantasy plot in what was meant to be a gritty, realistic story. Unfortunately, Requiem scurries at full speed ahead into the fantasy elements, to the point where I honestly wouldn't have been surprised if a wizard had shown up by the end. It clashes wildly with the story of two siblings trying to survive, as it tries to become something that would be more in line with Bloodborne. It's way too confusing and takes away from what could have been a much more grounded narrative and been more effective because of it. Moving back to those two siblings, I feel confident saying that these two should definitely be nominated for the Performance of the Year, and if the Game Awards were tomorrow, I'd probably give it to Amicia. But there's still one challenger left who could claim that throne. It takes a lot to beat out the untouchable Ashley Birch and her Aloy, but that's how harrowing Charlotte McBurney's performance is. The happiness, the anguish, the sorrow, she delivers all of it beautifully. The previous game's title of Innocence retroactively makes your skin crawl, as you realise just how depraved Amicia has become since her ordeals in France. McBurney shows us a side of Amicia that I never thought could exist, but the horrors of what she's been through have taken a massive toll on her psychologically. There is, however, one thing about the voice acting I despise. Well, two things. One is how many ASMR voice lines are in the game. There is more whispering in this game than any other I can think of, and if you need to whisper this much, maybe you just shouldn't be talking. The other, which is significantly worse, is the Americanization of all the characters. No one speaks with a French accent anymore. What the hell? That was one of the best parts of the last game. Seriously, in the next 10 seconds, see how many French video game characters you can think of that aren't assassins. I have no idea why they thought to take this out. It was so wonderful to play as a character with an exotic accent, and then you removed it for literally no reason I can think of. It's just a weird, lousy decision. My biggest complaint about the story is a spoiler, which I will only say after the hint for next week's game, so don't worry, but please come back to hear it after you finish the game. A Plague Tale Requiem story succeeds in a lot of places, like voice performances, characters and their development, but the narrative itself stumbles into fantasy elements that take away from the parts of the game I care about, the main characters. Requiem is trying to tell an eldritch fantasy legend, when it should be trying to tell a plague tale. Okay, so feel free to tell me if I'm wrong or anything, but everything we did over the whole 2 games was for nothing? It's okay that we could have killed Hugo at any time and stopped the plague, but the fact that we did it anyway means all that searching and rescuing was a total waste of time. That's a really terrible ending.